Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. We're just going to wait for another minute or so to let people filter in. Okay, we're 2 past the hour, so I think we might get things started. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us for this webinar on how to transform your VoC strategy. A quick summary of who we've got speaking today, and let me start with Jason. So Jason is a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience in client and supplier roles. He's been instrumental in creating large-scale customer experience programs across various industries. Currently, as a Director of Consumer Insights at Sekisui House, Jason's passion lies in understanding why people behave the way they do. His mission is to help teams create effective messages, products, and solutions that resonate with consumers and drive growth, ultimately helping people find their way home. I'm sure that those joining us from Australia don't know what Sekisui House is, but the next company should probably be a little bit more familiar to as I introduce Stephen. So Stephen has more than 30 years experience in the consumer insights industry with various roles spanning government, commercial, and not-for-profit sectors in Australia and North America. As Senior Manager of the Voice of the Member for RAC, Stephen is responsible for managing one of Western Australia's largest and most diverse market research programs. This includes a member experience monitor, comprising 20 continuous tracking studies across the monitoring, insurance, travel, and tourism, finance, security, and home sectors. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you for Jason for both joining us. What we want to talk about today, and I think this kind of really encapsulates the antithesis for us saying, hey, we really need to do a webinar on this. I know most of us who are on this webinar are probably in the CX or insights of VoC space, but there's also another hat that we wear inherently, and that's the hat as a consumer. And I know I certainly really tend to roll my eyes a little bit when I see someone requesting yet another survey from me. And it just seems like the volume of surveys that I'm receiving as a consumer has just gone through the roof in the last 5 years. And it feels like I'm getting surveyed about every little aspect of every little thing that I do in my day-to-day life. And I really don't think people like it. We're sending more and more surveys all the time and probably by and large producing quite a negative experience for our customers. And it really begs the question, why are we doing it? I might pass to Jason first to see if you've got any ideas, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And I'll tell a story that probably a lot of folks can relate to. I traveled last weekend and traveled by airplane and rented a car and stayed in a hotel, and immediately following that weekend got surveys about every single one of those experiences. And at home, we recently got a new puppy, so we're ordering constantly from Chewy and Petco, and we are getting the same exact survey over and over and over again about every single purchase. And, I think what's happened is it's just so easy to do. It's so easy as an organization to say, hey, I'm going to send a survey. I'm going to set something up. And, 10 years ago, gosh, almost even 5 years ago, it used to be that to do and put together a VoC or CX program, whatever your nomenclature was, it was a really major investment. You had to really kind of sit back and think about how you're going to measure what sort of investment that you're going to do. And it's just at such a different place where it's just like, hey, we're going to send a survey, we're going to turn it on. There's DIY systems. And I think one of the other pieces is that there's no repercussions right now for sending massive amounts of surveys out. And it's just a way, I think, for organizations to say, hey, we're doing CX, we're checking the box. But I think to your point, it's doing a bit of a disservice because I'm not sure that we're really getting feedback in the volume or in the way that we want to get it anymore, because we're getting over surveyed about every single interaction.
And what about yourself, Stephen?
Yeah, jump in here, Ryan. It's interesting you say, Jason, about your travel example. I've got another travel example in the last month or so where I travelled and I hired a car for 3 days, and I received a survey request to rate my car hire experience before I even had received the keys to the car, before I walked out of the office to get to my car. And I agree with you. I think it's just very easy. I think the availability of these self-service tools has really helped to proliferate the use of surveys and the popularity of metrics such as NPS as well. As you say, I mean, if I go back in earlier life when I was working in agencies, undertaking a voice of customer survey was a big thing. I mean, mostly these surveys were being done via phone or via intercept surveys, and they were very expensive. So you had to invest a lot of time into the design of the survey and get the most out of those surveys. And the cost was very much dependent on the size of your sample. So a lot of work went into ensuring we had balanced samples and good quality checks. Whereas now with online, it's just easy just to fire out a whole heap of surveys, and there is no additional cost for that sample. What I've sort of seen in the last few years is sort of ironically, the voice of customer surveys have been almost evolved, become more organisational centric than customer centric in a way. So I see where surveys have become almost, I use the word sabotaged by the business, to move away from the original intent being truly to understand the customer and the customer experience, to suddenly being used as a tool that can help management. So a reporting tool for the supplier KPIs for corporate scorecards, or supporting staff incentive programs. And as soon as you start linking these surveys to KPIs and particularly staff incentive programs, there becomes a need to get more sample, because people want more confidence in the data, and they're not happy with a KPI unless they feel comfortable that it's supported by large sample sizes. So yeah, I see that there's a proliferation of these surveys, but they are becoming, ironically, less sort of customer focused and more about the organisation, not about the customer. It's more about reporting and management.
Yeah, it's interesting. So let me ask you a question, Jason. Why are organisations so addicted to the metrics that are attached with these surveys that we're sending out? And let's be honest, by and large, a Net Promoter Score.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer, but I think there's a few things that have been happening. I think one is the kind of the software solutions that have been providing CX have been really pushing metrics. I think it's a way kind of for them to show their worth, and it's their focus on saying you need to measure, you need to have NPS. And then, oh, by the way, we've got a text analytics tool to give you the why behind it. And a lot of the messaging that's out there from the software and vendor providers in this space are just so focused on NPS and a metric. And they're not so much focused on understanding. And I think it's a way in the industry speak to say, if you have a metric, you have a CX program, and they become synonymous with one another, as opposed to you have a CX program. And what does that really mean? Because it takes a lot more work to think more holistically about what is a CX program? What am I looking at? What am I trying to understand? And I think from an organization standpoint, to some ways, it's a way to check the box. And it's a way to say, well, we have an NPS score, therefore we have a CX program. And in organizations, oftentimes there's roll-ups to the board and there's scorecards. And if you have a score and you're seeing some movement, then everyone sort of nods their head and saying, you know what, we're doing CX. But I think it's nowhere near where it needs to be. But I think those are some of the reasons why we've kind of seen this just solely metric-driven sort of purpose that's been overlaid and become synonymous with CX.
And I know earlier, Stephen, you mentioned that management teams, when it comes to thinking about CX as a tool within the organization, have a tendency to focus on the metric, use it as a KPI and really focus on trying to maximize that KPI. Is there also some pressure from the vendor side as well to send even more surveys? You know, perhaps it's almost like when you buy a hammer, everything becomes a nail, and suddenly just sending more surveys is the answer to everything?
Well, I think the research industry in itself has a role to play here, and in some ways has helped fuel that, because they sort of ridden on the back of that demand for metrics and supported that. I think the reality is that everyone's just getting busier, and management and leaders are really, really busy. And the simple fact is it's just easier to interpret numbers and try and understand people. And we know the behavioural science field shows us that too, is that when people assess value or try to assess value, they tend to give greater weight to factors that are just easier to assess. And numbers are easier to assess because you've got a number, you can see how that number moves. So I think it's just basic human nature to be attracted to numbers just because of the ease and simplicity, and particularly when you think about executive or leadership teams that are dealing with so much more and are really busy and have to keep their eyes on a number of different aspects of the organisation. It just makes it a lot easier. But yes, I agree with you, Ryan. I think researchers in many ways have a little bit to blame here, because especially agencies, where they've jumped on that bandwagon and they've fueled that desire to satisfy the metrics. I think the other thing, though, just in defence of researchers, is that traditionally we just simply haven't had time to analyse large unstructured data sets. I know personally, I mean, I've always known that in any sort of voice of customer program, the gold lies in those free text responses. But you just simply haven't had the time to be able to analyse that data and give it the credit that it's worth. So, you know, as a result, the research design tends to be driven more by a need to make it easier for the researcher, easier for the organisation, and ironically, it's more difficult for our respondents.
It's such a, I think the use of ironic is very apt there, because you get into a situation where an organization might genuinely care. You know, they might have a very noble goal of, we want to make sure we are customer centric, we are customer focused, we're producing good customer experiences. Therefore, we're going to start by measuring the experience that we deliver. And they end up with a survey experience that actually is running in the complete opposite direction to the overall goal of providing that better experience. And it can seem easier, right? Just to measure the number. It seems like, oh, this is easy. We're measuring the Net Promoter Score. But then when you get down the path and you start to see shifts in that score that you don't like, and you're trying to figure out why, all of a sudden you found yourself in a storm of, it's actually quite difficult to figure out the why unless you set it up properly in the first place. And so you've got a metric that's telling you a number that you can't get to the root cause of, and it leaves you with not a lot of tools to do anything with. Yeah,
and as much as we encourage our stakeholders to read the comments, a lot of our stakeholders tell us they simply don't have the time. So tell us what are the themes in the comments, or what are our members saying. I don't really have the time to be sitting down and reading all of those comments. So it is a challenge, I think, with everyone being busier. And as I said, there's just this natural inclination to focus in on numbers because that's quick and easy.
So, Jason, what are some strategies that insights teams can implement to try and avoid the over-reliance on surveys in particular, and also the metrics from executives, without really compromising on the value that your executive stakeholders are expecting to receive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple things that I've seen be successful. I think one of the things is really, and this takes time, is to define what is your North Star and your CX purpose and having a very, very clear statement. And kind of underneath that statement is, what are the experiences that you are hoping to curate for your customers? What are those meaningful moments of differentiation? And maybe what are some of the interventions that your brand or company are trying to put in place to ultimately lead to those experiences you're trying to curate? So it takes it out of like NPS, and NPS for recommend, that doesn't always apply to different industries. Like, your end goal might not be wanting to recommend, but your end goal generally is something around your CX purpose and the experience you're trying to deliver. So with executives, I try to make sure that that mission statement and that purpose and the behaviors and the moments are really, really front and center. And then we just really need to dig through the open-end commentary and really look at the feedback and the stories that our customers are telling us and relate those to those end experiences that we're trying to create. And I think it takes a bit of a shift, because it's really easy to say, hey, we had an NPS of 40 last month and we're at 46 this month and we improved by 6, or we're at 40 and we dropped to 34 and we decreased by 6. But I think there's the more value in who are you trying to be as an organization? What is that purpose? And I think another thing that is really helpful, at least from an insights team, when you're working with your CX practice, is start every meeting with a personal story about a customer and get it out of the number. Always start with, here's what Jim said, or here's what Jane said, and here's their experience, and here's what they told us. And tell those stories and really focus on humanizing the information that you get back. And it takes it to a completely different conversation when you get it out of the more metrics and did we have movement one way or the other from an NPS perspective.
And Stephen, from your point of view, what does a good VoC program look like?
Yeah, so for us, it's more about trying to rediscover the original intent of the survey. I know we can't escape from metrics, and we still need to have metrics, but we need to, as Jason said, humanize the survey and humanize the feedback more, and remind people that we are dealing with real people here, and we really trying to invest to improve the experience. So yes, uncovering the stories and telling those stories. So for us, it's almost been trying to wean people off this intense sort of desire to be tracking metrics. So in some ways, we've actually restricted access to our dashboards and our data, because we don't want people sitting on a day-to-day basis checking their NPS number. We prefer that they're looking at the stories or the feedback from their members. And it's a journey, because we're trying to educate our stakeholders that the survey tool is not a management tool, it's more of an insights tool, but they can help manage the experience. The key here is to identify through the research what are those key aspects of the experience that are really important in driving that outcome, and then what can the organisation do to manage those aspects on a day-to-day basis. And that's where then the survey almost becomes, by the time we get to the end of the month, our stakeholders sort of know what their NPS scores are going to be, because they've been managing the experience. So a good example is for our roadside assistance business, we know that wait times, so the time that people are waiting on the side of the road waiting for assistance, is critical in that experience. In particular, a pain point is where that wait time goes over the hour. There seems to be this sort of magic sort of psychological barrier that as soon as you're been waiting more than an hour on the side of the road, it taints the whole experience. So in that instance, our logistics team can monitor and manage wait times in real time. So they're now focused on managing the proportionate jobs where the wait, we're trying to minimise the proportion of jobs where the wait time is over the hour. So we've discovered an internal hard metric that they need to manage, and by managing that, they'll know how well they'll perform at the end of the month. So the survey is a scorecard, but we're primarily using it to uncover those stories and those insights, and then they're using their own hard internal data to manage the business, not the survey itself.
Yeah, interesting. And when it comes to trying to uncover those stories, I mean, even I've got on the screen here your standard Net Promoter Score question. This question is, if you're using the Net Promoter Score system as prescribed, this is the question that it prescribes. And it is a pretty open-ended question, but it is still somewhat restricted because it's asking you why you gave a score to recommend. And the reality might be, oh, well, I wouldn't recommend this company anyway. So it's kind of restricting the answers down to the context of would you or wouldn't you recommend. How could we perhaps change this perspective and try and collect and data that allows us to more get to those stories of the experiences that customers are experiencing themselves?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that can really make a difference. I think one is the way, whatever metric that you have, whether it's NPS or OSAT or, likely to repurchase, the follow-up of that is really critical. I think to your point, if you follow up with, well, why did you give it a 6? And the person's like, well, I don't know. I don't know why I gave it a 6. That's not necessarily a natural way to process. But what is more natural is asking people to tell you a story. And tell me a story about that experience. Or how would you describe your experience to a neighbor, friend, spouse? When we have questions that are a bit more open-ended and we can follow up with some prompts, the commentary actually becomes a lot longer and richer. And people do a nice job of kind of thinking and reflecting and telling. It's more in their natural voice. So I think one of the big things is how you ask that open-ended question. And I think the second piece that can be really powerful is making sure that, if we call them surveys, that they're more personal and conversational. We have the ability today to not just send the same survey out. We know so much about people. I'll take, again, my pet experience. I'm getting the same exact survey over and over and over again, and I think there's a way to be more conversational and more personal in the way that the questions come across, and also really show that the feedback that you're asking for is valued. And I think as an organization, one thing that we're doing here a bit at Sekisui House is even responding to people who send in a survey and say, thank you for your feedback. It was really important. So it's not just going off into the ether, but you're sort of taking that next step. And then also showing on some cadence what you're doing with the feedback that you're getting. And then it starts to show the value of why feedback is really important. But I think, again, to your first question, I think so much of this is about getting people to talk about their experience and tell stories. And that's been a major, major shift that we've done here internally and has been very powerful and helpful.
Stephen, I first came across this idea of switching to asking more for the story rather than asking why when I saw the work that you were doing at RAC. Could you talk to us for a little bit about what kind of inspired you to make that change and why it tends to elicit richer results, and perhaps any examples that you've got?
Yeah, sure. So like Jason said, we're very similar in the sense that we're trying to elicit more stories from our members and humanizing and personalizing those surveys more. And remembering back when I first started doing research and collecting a lot of this data via phone or via intercept, you had to be more personal because you actually had human interaction. You had interviewers dealing with customers. For me, the aha moment and the real insight and inspiration came from a TED talk that Daniel Kahneman did, which is freely available on YouTube. And if anyone's interested, I would really highly recommend that you find his talk. It's called The Riddle of Experience versus Memory. Daniel Kahneman in this talk talks about this concept of two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. So just to sort of quickly summarize that, at the moment, we're in the experiencing self. We're experiencing this webinar, so people are listening to me. But the reality is that you're not going to remember everything I say. And in fact, Daniel talks about that each moment of our lives lasts about 3 seconds, and it's lost without a trace. So no, our memory is not like a roll of film. We can't go back and just pull out the roll of film and retrieve those memories. What happens, or what the behavioural scientists are understanding now, is that we reweave those memories. So our remembering self really sort of captures key moments of experiences. So intense moments, peaks, troughs, maybe the ending of an experience. So it's interesting because I thought, well, hang on a second, we can't expect people, and people can't remember every aspect of an experience. So why are we asking them? Why are we doing the traditional survey where we're asking to rate every single aspect of an experience? Because the reality is that they simply can't. But I think one of the most important points that Daniel makes in his talk is that it's the remembering self that drives that future behaviour, that actually makes our decisions. So there's a quote in his talk where he says, we don't actually choose between experiences, we choose between memories of experiences. And for us, in terms of our member experience program, the ultimate aim of improving our member experience is to improve the loyalty for our members. We're hoping that they have great experiences with us, so they're more likely to stay with us, perhaps sort of increase their share of wallet with us. So if we're trying to understand, we're trying to drive that loyalty, we need to understand what aspects of those experiences are people internalizing, committing to memory, because it's that memory of the experience that's going to drive that future behaviour. So really, we from that inspiration, we changed our surveys radically. We moved away from the long surveys where we're asking members to recall and assess each minute aspect of that experience. So as an example, for roadside, rather than simply asking people to rate the phone call when they called for assistance, the wait time, the patrol, the tow vehicle, etc., to asking them more about what is their memory of that experience. So we have a deliberate lag in the timing of the survey. So getting back to my earlier example around the car hire, we're not really interested in that in-moment experience. We actually want to find out 2-3 days after that experience, what is that memory? And what you can see there on the screen is an example from an analysis of our member stories using Kapiche. This is looking at our auto servicing business and the key moments or intense moments that are recalled by two of our customer segments. We have on the right-hand side Lorraine, who's our older, more established member, and the left-hand side Druvik, who is our younger member. And what's really fascinating when you start looking at their stories is that these two members have exactly the same experience, but their memories of the experience are quite different. So Lorraine, in this example, is more likely to remember the interactions that she has with the frontline staff. She's recalling the courtesy bus, the member discount, whereas Druvik is recalling how fast he's more interested in getting in and out, dropping his car off, leaving, and he's more concerned about receiving a large bill or being ripped off. He's less, I guess, less experienced. So it's really fascinating that the memory that these two segments have of the same experience can be quite different.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But
I've got a
yeah.
I've got a slide here, Stephen, as well, that kind of summarizes, well, not summarizes, but shows some of the metrics that changed for you all when you decided to change that survey structure and switch to asking for the story. Any of these metrics surprise you, or is this what you were expecting?
A bit of both, really. So what we're seeing here, similar to what Jason's saying. So rather than just simply asking a member, why did you give us a 6 or why did you give us a 7? We firstly prompt our members if they'd spoken to someone about that experience. If they had spoken to someone about that experience, then we ask them about the conversation that they had. So what was the conversation? If they haven't spoken about the experience, we present a scenario to members. So, for example, you're at dinner with a friend and they ask, have you any experiences with our auto servicing business? And we find that presenting that scenario or presenting the question in that context, it more humanises the survey, it more personalises the survey. So we find that more people or pretty much all of our members are more inclined to provide a response. So traditionally, we never make an open-ended response mandatory in our surveys because we know that leads to more dropouts. But when we're asking members, why did you give us a 6 or why did you give us a 7? We get a large proportion of members that simply skip the question altogether, or they give you a very thin answer. It might be 1 or 2 words. They might say service, or good price. But when you present the scenario and ask members to tell us their story, we're getting a significant uplift in the proportion of members that firstly give us feedback in that open-ender, but probably more importantly, the richness of that text is much greater. So what that middle chart there is showing is the number of terms in each verbatim. So we're getting more text essentially, but also the grade scale or the quality of that data improves because it's just more human. It's right as Jason said, people don't think about why did I give a 6 or a 7, but they can tell you about their experience. So we're getting richer responses and we're getting less dropouts. And that's largely again because the survey is more designed for the respondent in mind. It's not a long-winded survey that's very corporate, sort of very academic. It's more of a conversation. So there's something in here.
All of these stats are interesting. The one in the middle, I think, is great because it kind of confirms what Jason and yourself were saying before around if you ask for the story, you get more information back, and that's amazing. I think the thing that surprises me the most is that not only are you getting people giving you more information about the story, but you're also getting more people complete the survey, which I initially, when I saw this data, I was like, oh, that actually seems somewhat counterintuitive. But I guess when someone's asking you to tell them about your story and kind of giving you a platform, I guess I can see how that might increase the completion rate. So it's great that actually came to fruition.
The other interesting thing there, Ryan, just very quickly, is you can see that I've segmented that by age. So our older members will persist and will give us a response. They'll persist in getting through the day. But younger people, as soon as they're not engaged, they just get out altogether. So it's even more critical for our younger audiences that we know are harder to get hold of and harder to get a response to design these surveys so they're more customer focused and more respondent focused.
Yeah, just to add to that, Ryan, sorry, it was just we've seen the same thing. When it feels more like a conversation and almost like a text back and forth, it's about them, it's not about us. And I think a lot of the CX surveys that you see, it's very much about the brand, right? Like we're asking you to give us a score and follow up. But when you make it more conversational and personal and you ask people to tell a story or talk about their experience, then it's about them. And when it's about them, they'll expand and they'll talk a lot more. Yeah,
good point. So what really strikes me about this and about what you're both saying regarding asking for the story, this is probably the complete antithesis of the majority of surveys that I see out there. Let's just stick to Net Promoter Score surveys for a minute. When I see the standard Net Promoter Score, if I was to kind of segment it into different buckets, the group of surveys that I see that are asking for the story is measured in 0.00 something percent. The percent of surveys that I see that are asking for a why did you give that score might be measured in the 10 to 20%. The percentage of surveys that I see that ask why did you give this score, but actually it's a multi-select list where I can choose the reason, and the last option is always other, tell me the other. That is by far the predominant way that I receive surveys when I'm a consumer. And I presume the reason for this is that they think it's going to be easier to do some sort of driver analysis when they only give the user a set list of options to choose from for the why. And I assume they're thinking that they understand their users, they understand what the why is likely to be. So I'm making it easier for the user to complete the survey, which your data shows, Stephen, and what you're talking about, Jason. In fact, the opposite is true.
But what you're saying, right, and what I mentioned earlier, I think that you're talking about those sort of closed response codes and then an other. Largely that's been done to make it easier for the researcher because, as I said, traditionally dealing with large volumes of unstructured text has been really complex and really difficult. Certainly, when I recall back, we used to have a team of people that would sit together in a room and read comments and develop code frames, and it was a big, expensive exercise. But what we need to remember is that from a respondent point of view, those sorts of questions have a much higher cognitive load because the respondent they'll read that question, they'll think of the response in their mind, and then they need to read through all of those options and work out which options best suit their response. And that takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. And I think invariably most people with sort of satisficing through the survey don't do that. So they'll give you a response. It's easier to get through the survey by ticking the boxes. Whereas simply asking someone to tell us your story or tell us about your experience is so much easier for the respondent to do. And you're getting much more richer feedback as a result, better quality data. And also you're not limiting yourself just to what your preconceived options are, which tend to be in from what I've seen traditionally, they're very internally scripted and focused. They're a very inside out approach. So yeah, I mean, you're making life harder for your respondents for the end goal, I guess, of having answers in nice boxes for the researcher that makes it easier to report.
So, and to Stephen's point, Jason, he just mentioned how we used to have a room full of people that would do coding to try and get these open-ended responses into something that was digestible by the business. Everything you're both talking about here in regards to asking for the story and really understanding that story to therefore understand the experience isn't possible without technology, right?
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, I think, technology has just changed the game. I think to Stephen's point, we used to have this like room of coders and in these code books, and it used to just take so much time to make sense of it. And now it's not necessarily a click of the button, but what technology has enabled us to do is really look through massive amounts of content and comments, but it helps us identify themes through natural language. And then it helps us put those themes into palatable buckets that we can then explain back to end stakeholders. And those themes we can look at as changes over time. Those themes can be brought to life because you have quotes and you have the people that said it. And so whereas, it's nice to have metrics and do driver analysis and look at scores and changes over time, I think it's much more powerful to look at the themes and the comments and the stories. But technology helps us make sense of all that and take it from, comments to real themes and real things that we can take action on.
Yeah. And so what's interesting about that is technology has been around for a while, right? Particularly in this area. And let's be direct about it. Text analytics technology has been around for a while. what I've found in the industry is that the technical solutions that have come along have tried to take the mentality of pick from these reasons of why you gave that score and applied it to the text analytics. So they've done a kind of tops down approach of going, oh, you're in this industry, therefore your customers are likely to talk about these things. Let's pre-train a model so that it can go and find where people are talking about those things for you. In actual fact, that is not the process that Stephen was describing by having a room full of coders. The process that Stephen was describing of having a room full of coders was being able to understand, first of all, read some data, do a bottoms-up analysis and understand what people are saying, develop the code frame, and then go through and code the data. And unless the technology is helping you to really do that bottoms-up approach, you're probably not going to get far with it. Does that match your experience, Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly less biased. I mean, the problem is that people find it very difficult to get. I mean, we're immersed in this sort of stuff every day. We're immersed in our businesses. We talk the language of our businesses. So if we are developing our own code frames and then training a model to match those code frames, it's inherently biased because it's almost a lost cause. It's almost going back to where we were before with pre-select text boxes, because we are pushing data into our own preconceived ideas as to what's important. One thing I found that's been a real eye-opener for us is that once you dive into the language that your customers or our members are using, it's very different to the way that we describe our business. So not only are we better able through that bottom-up approach to really truly understand what's important to our members, but what's important the way that they articulate it in their language. Give you a really good example is that we're diving through roadside assistance stories, and we found that a lot of members were talking about the end of that experience and the fact that the patrol officer was waving goodbye to them. Now, that's not something we had never thought about in terms of asking a question. We didn't think that was an important aspect. We didn't even really think to ask that question. But unless you're doing that bottom-up approach, you'll never uncover that. And that turned out to be, a really valuable way that we close the experience on a high and also reinforce the trusted brand. It's just simply a wave goodbye to a member after they've rescued them on the side of the road. So there's so much value in understanding the language that your customers are using and those themes, but it has to be done from a bottom up. Otherwise, you're working within your own silos or buckets and just forcing that text.
If you knew to train the system to look for people waving goodbye as they drove off, you'd be some sort of oracle, I think. Is there a level as well? Something I've noticed in insights and VoC and CX programs is you take a result to a stakeholder, and it's a result or it's an insight that they don't want, but it's not what they were hoping to see. It might not be a positive insight, and the first reaction tends to be skepticism around, well, how is this collected and is this valid? Does doing a bottoms-up approach and removing the bias from a tops-down approach mean that you can then have some better strategies for trying to combat that skepticism? I'll ask that to either of you.
I'll say, Ryan, when we look back on those storyboards, the Kapiche storyboards you saw earlier comparing Druvik and Lorraine, that's really powerful for us, because I can stand up in front of our stakeholders and say, this is not my interpretation of the data. This is what your members are actually saying. And the value here is that people can easily look at those storyboards and understand the key concepts and themes and coming from their own members without my interpretation of the data. So yes, the ability to visualize those key themes can be very useful, particularly if you are communicating insights that may be controversial or not very positive, because you're distancing yourself. Because you're right, that some people would naturally say, well, that's your interpretation of the data. But when you've got the ability to say, well, no, actually, here is the comments from your members in a visual way, that's easy for people to see the patterns and understand the main themes. That can be really, really useful in overcoming that resistance.
Yeah. So, Jason, we've spent a lot of time here talking about how do we make surveys better and how to produce a better experience for our customers. And of course, that's an important topic. But it also strikes me that in today's modern way of doing business that is highly digital, we also have access to a range of different other voice of the customer data that pertains straight to the experience these customers are receiving or experiencing, that a lot of organizations and a lot of VoC programs aren't making use of. What is some of this data that you've seen, and what is the best way to try and get some value out of it and perhaps reduce the reliance on surveys and therefore reduce the burden on our customers?
Yeah, another great question, Ryan. I have kind of two things. One is inspiration is everywhere. So, there's so many ways to be inspired by other stories, whether it's, your personal life, your professional life. And, you should look for like little moments to sort of get up in the morning and do better. And my other saying is feedback is everywhere. There is just so much opportunity and avenues for feedback that we're not capturing. There is feedback from the customer support agents, from, their call logs, from their notes. If you've got a CRM system, be it, HubSpot or Salesforce, your folks should be making comments and notes in the emails and the text and the telephone calls to review sites to social. There's so much out there. And a lot of the commentary and the feedback is in real time. And it's just having a system and really, as an organization, making the investment in having some sort of platform and single source of truth to bring that all together. And ultimately, in an organization, CX is everybody's responsibility. It's not one person or one department or one role. And when it becomes everyone's responsibility, then everyone has a role in collecting, collating, and putting feedback together. And I think one other thing that we've done here at Sekisui House is we're asking for feedback from our sales team, our marketing team, our customer care team, our superintendents, in addition to asking for our own homeowner feedback. And getting that 360-degree feedback has been really powerful. And it makes those folks also feel more vested in the experience because we're asking for their perspective as well. So there is so much out there. And when you start to look at the sheer volume of data and information and you start to put it into your VoC program, to your point, there's a little less reliance on the survey and more reliance on everything else that's out there. And then the survey just becomes another, sort of data point in this whole mosaic of feedback. And like we've been talking about, technology and Kapiche is really helpful for putting all that unstructured data into a single place and then being able to make sense of it in a way that's compelling and strategic.
Stephen, some examples that I've seen across our customer base of I guess what you'd call varying degrees of unsolicited feedback. I've seen support conversations being used and even the notes that agents have written while handling support conversations. I've seen reviews from booking.com and from Google and from app stores. I've seen the scrape of social media data to understand the conversations that are happening about a brand on socials. Anything that you've seen at RAC?
Yeah, the online is huge. So we are probably like most businesses, more and more transactions are occurring online, more web chat, more interaction with members online. So we're increasingly being requested to, and there's a minefield of gold mine of data in web search terms, for instance. So how are members searching to get to our website? So what are they looking for? What are the queries that they're having? What are they typing into web chat? So there's a minefield of data there. The other area that traditionally we haven't really tapped into, that we're starting to tap into now, is more of our proactive member complaints and compliments. So a lot of that data traditionally has been very manual in the way it's been recorded and captured, but we see huge value in there, because that's often really the sort of lead indicator of problems or concerns in the member experience. So we're certainly having a look at that data now and trying to integrate some of those insights, as Jason said, into that sort of mosaic, and just add more data points than simply relying on the survey itself. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen. I might defer to some questions now. They've been coming in while we've been speaking, and I thought best to defer it to the end. There's one here that Jason, for you, that James has asked. And I think it's an interesting question. Earlier on, you mentioned any meeting that you go into that's focused on CX in particular, but perhaps any meeting at all, you should start with a personal story from a customer. The question is, should that story be positive, negative, or both?
Great question. I think the negative ones are really powerful, but I think a lot of it is about changing the way that stakeholders view negative feedback. I say feedback's a gift, and something negative is an opportunity to learn. And I think those experiences that didn't go so well are extremely powerful. And then within the organization, a lot of it is, how do we win that person back? How do we transform that experience? And we actually are starting to ask our stakeholders to go actively look for negative comments and look for experiences that didn't go well, because those are the things that tend to stick more. I mean, obviously we bring in the positive ones and the kudos and the memorable moments and try to think about those and replicate those. And that's extremely important to say, hey, we're on the right path and we're doing the right thing, and we'll do a mix. But I think oftentimes the negative ones, there's more emotion to it, and it brings up a different conversation because it's real. And then you think about, well, what do we do better next time? And is that a theme? So, I think it's probably different by every company, but those are just some of the things that found here.
Yeah, awesome. And related to that question, Jason, I think that's a great way to get people engaged with the experience. How do you make sure that you keep the conversation at a strategic level and not overly focus on just a single piece of open-ended feedback, but try and relate it back to the organization in a bigger way, to say, hey, this is just one example, but look at this?
Yeah, I think those are all the things we've been talking about, is trying to put those themes into some degree of volume. Like, are we seeing more positive or negative experiences month over month? Or are we seeing things that are more related to, personal service or follow-up? Is this a one-off? So a lot of it, to your point, is context, and trying to say, is this a one-off, or is this truly something emblematic of some themes that we're seeing? And are those themes sort of rising or falling? And I think the other point that with those meetings is, what is our purpose? I know I said that earlier on, but to what extent are the themes showing that we are really delivering and living up to our North Star? And so I think those are just some of the things that we kind of try to keep that perspective. And if it's a one-off, look, we'll note it. And then what we might do is in a month or next quarter go, are we seeing more or less of these? And that'll give us some credence there too.
Stephen, you mentioned that a lot of interactions at RAC are moving to digital. So let me really put you on the spot here and ask you to give out some free advice. Keeping in mind your digital channels, and perhaps even imagining for a moment that you are at a business with a large e-commerce presence. How do you ask your story-based question, or how would you take the inspiration from the behavioral economics field of trying to get to the story when you're dealing with an interaction that can be really transactional, like going online and buying a good to have it delivered?
Yeah, so in those lower involvement transactions, we do have less of a lag between the transaction and the survey itself, because otherwise it just people, it just falls off the memory. So we do follow up in much closer time scale following that experience. But again, still we are, and I think even for a low involvement experience, it's even more important that we try and ask less questions and keep it more open-ended. So, we really do, again, just focus in on those, tell us about your experience, as opposed to how would you rate the experience across all these different aspects. Yeah. So, so we still adopt the same sort of principle in terms of, again, not how would you rate us? It's not about us, it's about them. Tell us your experience, and then approach it in that way. But yes, I agree that those lower involvement transactions, there is more of a need of urgency to get feedback closer to the event.
And this question, I'll leave this question to whomever feels best placed to answer. Let's say you're in a situation where management really does care quite significantly about Net Promoter Score and measuring it and figuring out the why behind it. But your measurement program, for whatever reason, perhaps it's the survey, perhaps it's customer involvement, you are getting very low verbatim responses. But there is still the desire there from management to understand. So they are still consuming this information, but they're getting ends of, measured in the tens, maybe low hundreds. And there is a risk there that they take something that one customer has said and run with it unnecessarily. What's the ways that you can suggest to try and protect against those things?
So, look, I mean, we're quick at sort of bashing NPS and metrics. For me, there is a positive in that the interest in the metric provides an interest in the program itself and the feedback. So we haven't shied away at RAC from wrapping up in a bow, if you like, and talking about our member experience program as an NPS program. So we're leveraging that interest and that desire to capture a score, but as I said, the real value is in terms of the why and the experience in itself. There is a level of maturity that comes with this. I mean, there is always a bit like qualitative research. I guess you get a CEO viewing a focus group and one person makes a comment and all of a sudden that becomes the biggest issue. I think from what Jason was saying too, it's about really understanding those themes and how they're tracking and how do those themes relate to that business outcome. So we've done a lot of work in terms of understanding and mapping those themes back to actual real world behavior. So how predictive are those themes of predicting our members' retention rates? And as soon as you can start to link those themes to future behavior, suddenly you're influencing a metric that they really do care about. And that gives you a lot more ability to drive action against that.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're right at the hour, so I think we might park it there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I didn't think that we would take up an hour, but I think we could keep going, much to my surprise. But I know people have busy lives, so we'll let them get on with what they're doing. Steve and Jason, appreciate it a whole bunch that you're willing to come on and share your stories with our listeners around how you've managed to change your VoC programs to produce better insights. So thank you, both of you. And thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
See you, everyone. Cheers.